Hello everyone, it is one of those awesome days of the year again, full set spoiler day. I'm Nitsuhone, and every time a new set is spoiled, I immediately start working on my limited review videos of the set, and Modern Masters 2017 was fully spoiled this morning. Because this is a set that, for the most part, we won't get to draft a ton of times because it's in lower circulation than a standard legal set, I'm not going to be doing a full set review for it, as I intend to start doing with Amen Ket. However, I am still going to be doing a couple of my usual videos. One of these is the shorter video, my picks for the best commons and uncommons in each color in this set, Modern Masters 2017. And instead of that being on my channel, that's actually over on the Ether Hub, and you can find the link to that video in the description of the video below. And this one, a guide to the archetypes within Modern Masters 2017. This set is a little bit different than most of the recent ones we've seen in that R&D stated that they really built this set around 5 color pairs instead of the usual 10, but that these 5 color pairs can sort of combine together to make 3 color decks. And so in this video, we will talk about the synergies in the cards that you want to be drafting for each color pair, and we'll also discuss the synergies that exist between color pairs, and thus discuss what color pairs just go best together to make 3 color decks. Just a reminder, I don't discuss cards that are good in every deck in this video, so you won't see them on sort of the lists of cards that I show you, unless they have special synergies within a specific color pair. This includes things like removal that are just good in every deck. If you're looking for a video that discusses the cards that are most powerful just in a vacuum, that is more or less what my best commons and uncommons video is over on the Ether Hub. Now, let's get started with our first color pair. This time around, Wizards has included, instead of just one signpost card, they've included several signpost cards to help people drafting certain color combinations figure out what exactly they should be doing, instead of just including one like usual. These are gold cards that cost the 2 colors of a specific color pair. In the case of blue-white, we have 4 of these. We've got Vanish into Memory, Miss Meadow Witch, Deputy of Acquittals, and Momentary Blink. What do these all have in common? Well, they're ways to use creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities over and over again. And because they only really fit into a deck that's playing both blue and white, these are the cards that can be a good sign that this deck is open. So there's 2 big things that this color pair wants. One of these is things that allow you to blink, bounce, or flicker your creatures, and number 2 is creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities to abuse. First, let's look at the ways to blink creatures. So we already have our 4 gold cards that we've already seen. We've got Vanish into Memory, which is great because at instant speed you can exile a creature. And obviously that's good with Enter the Battlefield abilities. It doesn't come into play until your next upkeep. The best way to use a lot of these blink things is when you're also making a creature dodge removal, and that's kind of the scariest thing that can happen to your opponent. But Vanish into Memory also draws you some cards. It does get a little worse if you're blinking a creature who has more toughness than power, because you'll just end up discarding them all eventually. But it is a good card either way. Miss Meadow Witch is great because she has a repeatable activated ability that can be used over and over again to blink creatures, and if your opponent doesn't deal with that and you have a good Enter the Battlefield ability to abuse, you're probably just going to win the game. Deputy of Acquittals is a 2/2 with Flash that happens to also return a creature to your hand, so again, you can use it just to dodge removal, which is always nice, but it's best when you're abusing Enter the Battlefield ability. Momentary Blink lets you flicker a creature 2 times, basically, at instant speed. If you have 6 mana, you can do both of them at once. But generally you'll do one and then the other one later in the game. Flicker Wisp is just one of the best uncommons in the set because it's so flexible. You can use it to get your opponent's blocker out of the way on top of multiple other things, which I guess Vanish into Memory can do as well, incidentally. Familiar's Ruse is great because it lets you bounce a creature to your hand and counter a spell, and if you're doing that, you get to use it Enter the Battlefield ability again. Ghostly Flicker lets you do it with 2 creatures, lets you flicker 2 creatures. And finally, Core's Skyfisher allows you to play a very efficient flyer that also happens to bounce a creature to your hand. So we know that we have all these ways in blue and white to blink creatures, many of them at common and many of them at uncommon. The questions are, what is there for us to blink within Modern Masters 2017? And this is what we're looking at. We're looking at Attended Knight, a 3 mana 2/2 with First Strike, who gives you a 1/1 white soldier token. Not super exciting, but it's still value if you're blinking it. Core Hookmaster has a little bit more exciting of an ability in that it can lock down a creature for a turn, basically. Tap down a creature, it doesn't untap. This means you get 2 attacks without that blocker being able to block. Lone Missionary, also a little less exciting. You gain some life, which is good. Where you're really getting somewhere is when you go to the Splicers, like Master Splicer, who for 4 mana gives you 5 power, including a 4/4 Golem. And if you're blinking him, you're getting another Golem. Same thing with Sensor Splicer, except it's less efficient, and the Golem will only be a 3/3 with Vigilance if he's the only Splicer you control. But if you're blinking them, then you're going to get some very nice value. Urbis Protector similarly gives you a giant angel token, and you can make multiple copies of that angel token if you're blinking your Urbis Protector. Augur of Bolas isn't really an ideal card for this deck. I don't know that this deck will normally have like a critical mass of instants and sorceries for you to be able to hit them, but in the event you end up with an instant and sorcery sorcery-filled deck. Blinking Augur Bolas isn't too bad. Mist Raven is another really great one to blink on a similar level as Core Hookmaster because it gets a creature out of the way. Seagate Oracle can draw you some more cards. And finally, Wing Splicer is another splicer that makes you golems. And those are all the splicers are awesome to blink. They're probably the ideal thing, although Herbis Protector is pretty great as well. So those are the things you really want to be blinking. There's also some rares that we want to look at. This archetype video mostly focuses on commons and uncommons, but I also always try to talk about the rares in each color pair that fit nicely into an archetype. So we've got Ether Mage's Touch, which doesn't really blink a creature for you exactly, but it lets you look at the top 4 cards of your library and put a creature into play for free, which then at the beginning of your instep gets returned to your hand. But what that means is you get 2 Enter the Battlefield triggers. You can also abuse the card in other ways. If you use it at the end of your opponent's turn, you basically get a free swing with a creature you didn't pay more than 4 mana for. So if it was a large creature, that's great. Deadeye Navigator gives both itself and another creature the ability to blink itself just for 1 and a blue, which is incredible. That's another really gross, repeatable way to just win a game. Imagine putting it on Blade Splicer, our next card, and just having 6 mana open. Your opponent just dies to golems. But Blade Splicer is the one rare splicer in the set. It's great. And then there's Restoration Angel, which is, an amazing card in general. But then when you're really blinking something, you really feel like you're getting there. There's one card, though, that isn't blue or white that is actually the best thing to blink in the entire set. So if you see it and you happen to be in this deck, you should try as hard as you can to splash it, and that is Thragtusk. The reason he's so good is he has an Enter the Battlefield and a Leave the Battlefield trigger, and you get both of them when you blink him. So you'll be gaining 5 life and getting a Beast token, gaining 5 life and getting a Beast token, and your opponent is pretty much just dead when you do that. So that does it for blue-white. We'll talk in a little bit about the other colors that it pairs well with, but first let's talk about another 2-color pair, and that is green-white. Green-white is a color pair in this set that's sort of built around the Populate mechanic, and Populate is a mechanic that allows you to make a copy of a token that you have in play. Usually it's attached to cards that do various other things, as you can see here with Wayfaring Temple and Sundering Growth. But there's really 2 things you want in this deck. You want ways to more than 2 things. You want ways to make creature tokens, 1. Number 2, you want synergies for having creature tokens. And number 3, you want cards with Populate, who sort of fit well with, that really are synergies, but it's a very specific mechanic. First, let's look at the cards that have Populate in green and white. We have these cards here. Wayfaring Temple is just a great card in this deck because his power and toughness is equal to the number of creatures you control. And if you're making tokens, you're going to have a decent number of creatures. Then when he does combat damage to a player, you get to Populate. So he's sort of his own engine if your opponent can't stop him. Sundering Growth I have here. It's probably not main boardable. There just aren't very many artifacts in this set. There are a few enchantments, but not a ton. And so it's probably mostly a sideboard card. But it's a great sideboard card in this deck because if you get to blow up an artifact or enchantment and make a creature token, you feel pretty good. Eyes in the Skies is the only card in the set with Populate that actually fuels itself. The other things with Populate, it's worth noting, don't make creature tokens, and what that means is you have to have other ways of making creature tokens for Populate to work. But Eyes in the Skies at least lets you pay 4 mana for 2 1/1 birds with flying, which isn't too bad. It's not great either. Rootborn Defenses is kind of a mediocre combat trick. It gives your whole team indestructible, but if you're really getting there with this deck, it is playable because of Populate. Wake the Reflections it's hard to say exactly. 1 white mana to Populate doesn't really seem good enough. Generally, I'd like to have it attached to a relevant effect, like on Eyes in the Skies or Rootborn Defenses, instead of just doing it. But if you really got there on creature tokens, Wake the Reflections is pretty solid. Druid's Deliverance is probably my least favorite of all of them, but it's sort of like Rootborn Defenses in that it's an effect that I wouldn't mainboard, except for that it says Populate on it. It's also worth noting Rootborn Defenses says Populate first, so you get to make a creature token, and then you can block with it with Indestructible. So that's a pretty nice little ability that's attached to it. But those are the cards with Populate. Now let's talk about the ways to make creature tokens so that your Populate actually does something. These are those. We've got Call of the Conclave, one of our gold cards that makes a 3/3 Centaur creature token. Just a great raid, a 2 mana 3/3 is amazing. There's also Baloth Cage Trap, which is 5 mana for a 4/4 beast token, but it's an instant, so it kind of has flash, so you can eat a creature with it. On top of that, it's also a trap, and you can occasionally pay 1 and a green to put it into play, which is just amazing. And there's a lot of signets floating around and golems, so it could occasionally happen. Slime molding isn't something I'm super interested in personally because you're just never going to get the rate that you want. Although the cool thing you can do with it is it's basically, at least theoretically, the biggest token you can make. And if you can start populating like a 7/7 ooze token, that's pretty fun. Fists of Ironwood just makes you little saplings. And normally I'm not a fan of auras. You know that if you've seen my other videos. But I like auras that make it so that you don't lose value if the creature it's put on is killed. And Fists of Ironwood leaves you value behind in 2/1/1 sapling tokens. You can also give a big creature trample. Vital Splicer, another splicer. This one gives you a golem token, as they all do, but it can regenerate golems. Penumbra Spider is a nice little card, a good little green common, a 4-mana 2/4 with reach, who when it dies makes a spider token, and that's another pretty good thing to be populating, a 2/4 with reach. We have our friend Attended Knight again, who just makes a soldier. Not the most exciting thing to populate, but it works. Lingering Souls is just an incredible card in general. If you're playing it, you probably should be splashing black, but even if you're not, it's playable in basically any deck, and especially in this one because you like creature tokens. Master Splicer, another one of our Splicer friends we've seen before, as well as Urbis Protector and Censor Splicer, all make tokens, and they're all good things to populate. The 4/4 Angel token and the Golems are the things that you will most consistently be able to populate, most likely, and that's a good thing to have. There are also some other token synergies within green-white. One of these is Bronzebeak Moa, who I don't love a lot. You have to make sure you're able to play at least one creature every turn for it to be good. If you have, if like all your cards in your deck make creature tokens, or are creatures, you know, then it can be pretty good. But even then, it still has ups and downs. I'm not sure how I feel about the card on the whole, but it obviously is here for this deck to try to make it work. Soul Warden, on the other hand, I'm happy with because you gain a bunch of life in addition to making tokens. And then Intangible Virtue is basically like the ideal card if you're building this deck. You know, if you played an Innistrad block when this was originally printed, an Innistrad draft, it was like a build around enchantment because it was so powerful, and you can make all of your tokens have vigilance and get +1/+1. And similarly, Gaia's Anthem's sort of like a crappy Intangible Virtue in this deck, but that's still pretty good to pump your whole team. Those Anthem effects are great in a deck where you're making a bunch of tokens. There are, of course, also some rares that fit well into this deck. We've got Call of the Herd, which provides you with 2 elephant tokens, usually over the course of 2 turns. That's great. We've got our friend Thragtusk again, who's good in everything, but hey, he makes a beast token. Blade Splicer again, makes a golem token. Voice of Resurgence just makes tokens all over the place if your opponent starts trying to play spells during your turn. And Advent of the Worm just makes a huge token for the cost. And that's another very good thing if you're populating to make a 5/5 worm with trample over and over again. So the first 2 archetypes we talked about, as you may have guessed, go together quite well to make a Bant tokens blink sort of deck. Many of the cards that make tokens happen to be creatures who are good at blinking, and this is especially true of the splicers. If you play all 3 of these colors together, meaning blue, green, and white, you have access to all of the splicers in the set. So it's sort of like a splicer deck, but there's more than that going on. But this is sort of one of the ideal ways to combine two color pairs into this deck right here. Obviously, I just sort of have the splicers there as examples of what you can do, but that's one of the big things you gain access to by playing all of the colors together. Blue brings you more ways to blink your creatures, and there's also all of the other creature-based ways of making creature tokens that just fits really well into this deck, and they synergize very well together. To do it, though, you do need fixing, and I have, as you can see, Sylvan Ranger, who searches your library for any land you need, Avacyn's Pilgrim, who really only fixes you for white, and then both Signets. And when I talk about every single one of these color pairs, when they're combined together at least, and even when they're not, the Signets are great cards, don't get me wrong, because they ramp you, but when you're combining them together, you kind of need the Signets to really make it happen, especially if you're not in green and don't have access to Sylvan Ranger, so just something to keep in mind. You also get access to Rock's Warmonk with this color pair, the 3-mana 3/4 with lifelink. It doesn't do anything special, within this color, synergistic anyway. He's just a really good creature that you get access to. All right, so our next color pair is red-green, and that it is a go-wide deck. It has a somewhat similar goal to green-white, and in that it wants to go wide. It comes with a lot of ways to pump your whole team, which green-white does not have, and it has a lot less populate. The big difference between the two is mostly that the red-green deck looks to make smaller creature tokens for the most part than green-white, who is interested in using populate to make copies of much larger tokens. That's why it needs ways to pump the whole team, because these tokens on their own just aren't going to be enough. So let's look at the ways that red and green can make tokens. We, of course, have Giant Baiting, who we just saw, which is an interesting card. If you really have gotten going with making other tokens, it can actually be quite devastating for your opponent, because sometimes you can make 3/4/4 Giants. But unless you've really gotten there with other cards on this list right here, basically like Dragon Fodder and Fists of Ironwood, giant baiting usually won't be worth running, I don't think, unfortunately, for it. But Dragon Fodder's here. You know, it's back. It's a great, efficient way to make creature tokens. 2 mana for 2 goblins. You're going wide already. Goblin Assault makes you a goblin every turn. Does make it also, though, so all of your goblins have to attack, which isn't always a great thing. Fists of Ironwood, again, we see here for 2 mana. For 1 card, you get 2 Saplings, and then Vital Splicer gives you 2 creatures for 1. But as you can see, there aren't a ton of way of making creature tokens in red-green. Doesn't really seem like they R&D pushed it really hard to make red-green as good as it possibly could be as far as a going wide strategy. But what it does have, that green-white doesn't have, are great ways to pump the entire team. Gruul War Chant gives everything +1/+0 in Menace, and if you're facing an army of tokens, you're probably dead because that's just really hard to deal with. Tattermunge Witch is a little less impressive, but hey, it's a 2 mana 2/1. You'll play it anyway. And it also makes it so that when your opponent's just like, man, I just have to block, and you're like, okay, glad you blocked all of my 2 power Saplings. Now they all also trample over for 1. Gaia's Anthem's here again, pumps your whole team. Dynacharge has an overload that allows you to pump your whole team +2/+0 for only 3 mana at instant speed, and Scourge Devil can come out of the graveyard and pump your whole team. So this color pair has a ton of ways of pumping the whole team, more than green-white has. Green-white is better at making tokens, though, I would say. There are some rares that fit well into this deck. Our friend Call of the Herd is here, but so is Wart, the Raid Mother, who you can really slide into the red deck, the other decks in its color as well. But it's better probably in this deck because it gives you red and green Goblin Warrior creature tokens, and then you can use any red or green creatures you have to conspire spells, and you're going to have more red or green creatures if you're red-green. And then there's also Hellrider, who obviously wants you to control a ton of creatures. Now, once again, we're going to talk about a color pair that combines well with this, and that is green-white. Green-white, and I think red-green can't really exist on its own unless there's a way it can exist on its own. And that is that, let's go back to the commons here, and that is that Dragon Fodder and Fists of Ironwood are commons, and you can theoretically pick up like 3 or 4 of each of them, and then you've really gotten there, honestly, like in terms of just being able to cast one of these spells that pumps the whole team, which you can easily get your hands on as well. But it has a hard time getting there without the help of white being included, because white has a lot of the better ways to make creature tokens. So I think Naya tokens, sort of the ideal way to go if you can get the fixing. You get Call of the Conclave, which we saw. You get Urbis Protector. You also get all the white splicers on top of the green splicer. But you also get access to the great ways to pump your team, like Gruul War Chant and Dynacharge. You also gain access to Sunhome Guildmage, who himself is sort of there as a card that can make a red-white tokens deck work on its own. It's just not a color pair that R&D really focused on as much. But it is a color pair that works at making tokens. It's just not as good at it as, say, green-white is. But it's a great card because it can pump your whole team while also being capable of making soldier tokens. Again, you need the fixing, and you have access to green, so Sylvan Ranger and Avacyn's Pilgrim are once again going to be quite good. So Naya tokens, if you can get the fixing, is basically the best way to go for a token deck because you get the best of both worlds. You can pump your whole team really efficiently, and you can make better tokens, and that's sort of the way you want to go. So we'll move on to our next color pair now, which is black-red. And that color pair is focused on Unearth, which you can see here on Cathari Bomber. It's focused on Unearth and sacrificing as sort of a synergy related to Unearth. What Unearth means is that when you have a creature die, when it's in your graveyard, the creatures with Unearth have an activated ability. Oh, I guess it's an activated ability. Yeah, it has a colon. An activated ability that you can play them out of your graveyard at sorcery speed, and they gain haste, but they get exiled at the end of your turn no matter how they die. You can't do anything tricky to try to make it so they go to your graveyard. They get exiled no matter what you do, but it gives you some extra value out of your creatures who die. And Torrent of Souls is here. It's another black-red card. You can actually run it in as another way to pump your whole team in the red-green pump your whole team go wide deck, but it's not very efficient for that. But it gives you another way of reanimating creatures out of your graveyard. And this deck in general is graveyard-based and Unearth-based. So let's look at all the creatures who have Unearth, in addition to our friend the Cathari Bomber here, who's sort of the signpost uncommon for it. Cathari Bomber is quite good, by the way, for a couple reasons. We'll talk about it before we leave the Cathari Bomber here. And that is, first of all, it's a 3-mana 2/2 flyer. And when it hits your opponent, you do have to sacrifice it, but then it makes 2 goblins, and then you can bring it back from your graveyard, do it all over again, and get 2 more goblins. So it's a good way of making creature tokens. Not an amazing way since you keep having to lose it. But if you also have sacrifice synergies, that's going to work out pretty well. So first, let's look at the Unearth creatures. So here's what we're looking at in terms of Unearth. We have Scourge Devil, who we've seen already as a way to pump your whole team. You know, he's a fine card, whether you're playing him from your graveyard or from your hand, because he pumps your whole team. Definitely more efficient from your graveyard. Corpse Connoisseur is nice because he can sort of stock your graveyard with whatever it is you need. Whether it's something you want to reanimate, like you drafted Gristlebrand, you can put Gristlebrand into your graveyard, which is awesome, but the chances you do that aren't really high. Dregscape Zombie is just a nice little 2-drop who in the late game can spring out of the graveyard. Grixis Slave Driver, I think, is in terms of raw power probably the best of all of these common and uncommon Unearth Creatures because he gives you a zombie when he dies, so you can trade it, and then he comes back and gives you another zombie. So he leaves behind tokens, which are also good for sacrifice synergies. And then there's Vithian Stinger, who I think is also very good, mostly because it's just a creature that pings your opponent or creatures, and that's pretty effective in this format, it seems like. And, you know, being able to come out of the graveyard and do it one more time isn't bad either. There's also one card who's gold who fits really well into this deck, but his unearth cost is only black. So Corpse Connoisseur grabbing Sidraxis Spectre isn't the worst thing. Makes your opponent discard a card, and it also gives you a reason to splash blue in this deck, because if you can actually play this thing on turn 3, it's probably going to win you the game if your opponent doesn't kill it between doing 3 a turn and making your opponent lose a card every turn. So there are ways to sacrifice things in this format. We've got the black ways to do it. And the reason sacrificing is good, I should say, is when you unearth a creature, it's coming back, it's back, but you're going to lose it anyway. So you may as well get some extra value out of it. You can think of it on the flip side as well, that, well, my creature has unearthed, so losing it isn't as big of a deal as it would be otherwise. And in general, that means sacrifice effects are good for you in this deck. Plus, we just saw lots of different little ways that some of your unearthed creatures make creature tokens even, and those are good for sacrificing as well. So one of the best value things this deck can do, I think, is bring back an unearthed creature, Bone Splinters. Like that's a pretty powerful thing to do because your unearthed creature is dead anyway, and you just got to kill your creature. Gnawing Zombie, a little less exciting of a way to do it, but hey, he can drain your opponent. Mortician Beetle loves it if you're really getting there on the sacrifice sub-theme of this deck, because it just gets bigger and bigger. And Vampire Aristocrat can just eat unearthed creatures, if nothing else. I mean, sometimes you just won't be able to unearth the creature because it's too small, but if you can bring back a few creatures and feed it to the Aristocrat, that's pretty great. In red, we have access to Scorched Rusalka. Not an exciting way, but a way to get some extra value out of your sacrificed creatures. Skurzdag Cultist, a little more exciting of a way to get value out of your sacrificed creatures. Shocking things. And Traitorous Instinct isn't a sacrifice synergy, but if you're in this deck and you're already running these cards, you should probably also run Traitorous Instinct. It not only allows you to steal your opponent's biggest blocker and attack with it, you can then sacrifice it to Bone Splinters or Vampire Aristocrat or Scorched Rusalka and make sure it never comes back. In terms of rares for this deck, there is one rare who has Unearth, and that is Extractor Demon. He helps you fill your graveyard, which is a pretty cool little synergy that he has to help you get more unearthed creatures into your graveyard. And it's a great first pick anyway because it's a 6-mana 5/5 flyer, but it's really good in this particular deck. Once again, we can combine 2 different color pairs. In this case, if we add green basically to what we have going on here with black-red, we end up with Jund. And if you do Jund, you get access to Sprouting Thrinax, which is great. It's a great thing to sacrifice sometimes because it gives you 3 saplings more to sacrifice. So it's obviously very good with creatures who get bigger when you sacrifice things. Then there's, again, we have access to Mortician Beetle. It's going to be at its best in this version because this is the deck where you're really going to be sacrificing things. There's Skurzdag Cultist. This is just sort of basic examples of the cards you gain access to by adding green to this particular deck. You get Sprouting Thrinax and Golgari Germination, and you get the good sacrifice synergies of Skurzdag Cultist and Mortician Beetle, on top of a lot of other things. Green, as we've seen, has lots of ways of making creature tokens, which I'm not showing you here, but we've already seen it. And if you can make creature tokens and sacrifice them, that's another really great way to get some value. So Jund Sacrifice seems like a really sweet deck to play if you're going to go 3 colors with this deck. From here, we move to our last 2-color pair, which is Blue-Black Control. Of all the 5 primary color pairs in this set, Blue-Black is the one that is the least synergistic. It is basically just about drawing lots of cards, killing creatures, getting card advantage, and all kinds of value, and eventually sticking a big threat to close out the game. So it's just a control deck. No fancy mechanics here, just good old-fashioned grinding out wins. Blue and black are the 2 best colors in this set, and in most sets really, at slowing down opponents through removal, bouncing, and even counter spells in this set. Let's look first at the cards meant to disrupt the opponent and make the game last long enough for you to win. So in terms of disruption, we kind of have everything here. We have Dinrova Horror, who slows down your opponent by bouncing a creature, and if it's the only creature they have, they also have to discard it. Only card they have, I mean. Soul Manipulation gives you a nice little 2-for-1 a lot of the time. You can counter your opponent's creature spell and get a card back from your graveyard. The nice thing about Soul Manipulation, as opposed to most counter spells, is you can leave the mana up, and if you don't get the counter spell, you can still at least get a creature back. Sometimes that's the thing to do. Agony Warp is just a really efficient removal spell. You can kill something with 3 or less toughness. You can also use it sort of as a combat trick because it decreases power. Familiar's Ruse, we've seen it already. It helps you counter things. It's not as good in this deck as it is in the blue-white deck because this deck is not going to be capable of taking advantage of bouncing creatures, and it's just not going to play as many creatures in general. Crippling Chill gives you a way to slow your opponent and draw a card. Grasp of Phantasms gives you a way to bounce your opponent early game, and then again late game when you get the flashback. Mist Raven, who we've seen already as well, just bounces a creature. Rewind lets you counterspell basically for free. Wall of Frost is just a great little blocker in this deck, slows down your opponent a lot. Bone Splinters, again, not going to be at its best in this deck in terms of removal because you're not going to be playing enough creatures a lot of the time. Grisly Spectacle, though, is a great removal spell, as is Seal of Doom. So if you're just doing all of these 1-for-1s, which is what most of these cards give you, you're not going to be able to win the game. What you also need to have are lots of ways of drawing cards. You just need to outcard your opponent, so 1-for-1s for you are fine. 1-for-1s for your opponent become bad news when you're suddenly drawing a ton of cards. And there are lots of ways to draw cards in blue and black. We've got Recover, which lets you return a creature from your graveyard and draw a card, so it's a 2-for-1. Azure Mage, which lets you grind out games over the long haul by just drawing you extra cards every turn. Augur of Bolas will be like at its best in this deck because you get to look at the top 3 cards of your library, and you're going to have lots of instants and sorceries. Compulsive Research, if you're doing it right, usually only makes you discard a land card. Forbidden Alchemy doesn't really give you card advantage the first time, but it gives you card selection, and then the second time, it does give you card advantage because you've used 1 card to draw 2 cards. Tandem Lookout can give you, like a small evasive creature, the ability to draw a card when it deals combat damage to an opponent, and that's great. Serum Visions is also, it only draws you 1 card, but the Scry almost counts as an additional card because you can control your draws. Seagate Oracle gives you some card selection, and opportunity is one of the best things for this deck to have because if you draw 4 cards with this deck, your opponent's probably dead. There's also Soul Ransom, which is a cool little card. It lets you steal your opponent's creature, and then your opponent, if they want to, can discard 2 cards to get rid of Soul Ransom. But you get to draw 2 cards, so not only did you make your opponent lose 2, but you drew 2, so you're really gaining a lot there, especially if you stole like their best creature. They do get their creature back, obviously, but, Soul Ransom is a nice card to put your opponent between a rock and a hard place. Especially if they're in top deck mode, you're just going to get 1 free swing out of the creature you stole. So, despite all this card drawing and all this removal that you're playing, how do you actually win the game? And that's a pretty good question. And the way you win the game is by eventually sticking a big threat, and we're going to look at the common and uncommon threats who can help you win a game. The best of these is one of the gold cards for this color pair, and that is Moroi. Just gives you a huge flyer that's difficult to deal with. It does hurt you a little bit, but you're going to kill your opponent faster. Spire Monitor is nice in this deck because you can leave up magic. You can leave up mana for counter spells, and you can leave up mana for other things. And if your opponent doesn't do anything you want to respond to, you can just flash in the monitor. Wing Splicer, we've been seeing, through this whole video, gives you a 3/3 colorless golem token who has flying as long as the Wing Splicer is in play. And Abyssal Spectre is great in this too because it just devours your opponent's hand while slowly winning you the game. On the whole, I think of the 5 major color pairs in this set, blue-black is sort of the least supported. It's sort of just like a good stuff deck with a bunch of good removal, some nice efficient creatures, and usually the way you're going to win the game or end up in a deck like this is if you open a big scary bomb like Gristlebrand or something like that, where you'll just win the game if the game goes long because you'll draw it. If you don't get a huge bomb, just trying to win with Moroi isn't quite as good. You need a kind of bomb who will just win you the game on its own, the way Gristlebrand does, basically. So that does it for this limited review. It's a little shorter than the other ones I've done because there's only really 5 heavily supported color pairs. There are, of course, little spaces between the color pairs that we didn't really discuss, like a red-white deck, which I guess we discussed in passing. Those decks are possible. They're just not quite as synergistically supported as these 5, which R&D has talked about specifically as the 5 they focused on the most. And I'd say on the whole, all of the token-based decks, especially green-white and Naya, are going to me, seem like the most well-supported and the most powerful. And I also look most forward to playing it, although the blue-white Blink deck also looks like a ton of fun. So I'm really looking forward to this format. It won't be on Magic Online for, I think, 3 more weeks, but once it's on there, you'll see me drafting it at least a couple times here on my channel. I'll probably do at least one over on the Ether Hub as well. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to click the like button. If you want to make sure that you catch my future videos about limited formats as well as drafts of Modern Masters 2017, for example, don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any questions about this format or want to share your own thoughts on the format, post them in the comments, because talking about those things helps us all improve at Limited. Also, my content is sponsored in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all of your Magic the Gathering needs. You can go there and you can find a store, and you can use my discount code NITZAHONE5 to get a 5% discount. Thanks for watching.